Most students fear Harvard's infamous Economics 201, known campus-wide as the graveyard, because it has a 97% failure rate. Professors whisper about it in faculty lounges. Students switch majors to avoid it. Even the brightest minds from Ivy League preparatory schools emerge from Professor Katherine Blackwood's classroom broken, their confidence shattered like glass on concrete. But this semester, something unprecedented happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. While 32 of the world's most privileged students failed spectacularly, there was one person who not only passed, but achieved the highest score in the course's 23-year history. That person wasn't a valedictorian from Phillips Exeter. It wasn't a legacy student whose family donated millions to the university. It was Maria Santos, a 42-year-old single mother who spent her days serving mashed potatoes and wiping down tables in Harvard's undergraduate dining hall. Maria Santos arrived at Harvard's Annenberg Hall every morning at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before her official shift began. She had learned that those 3 minutes mattered. 3 minutes to tie her apron without rushing. 3 minutes to check that her hair was properly secured beneath the regulation net. 3 minutes to prepare her smile for the endless stream of 18-year-olds who would look through her as if she were part of the furniture. The dining hall in those early hours felt like a cathedral of stainless steel and fluorescent lighting. Empty tables stretched across the cavernous space like pews awaiting congregation. The industrial dishwashers hummed their mechanical prayers while Maria and her colleagues transformed the sterile space into something resembling warmth. Maria had been working at Harvard for 7 years, ever since her husband Carlos died in the construction accident that left her with twin daughters to raise and medical bills that multiplied like weeds in her mailbox. The university job came with health insurance and tuition assistance that her girls might someday use, benefits that made the early mornings and aching feet worthwhile. She served scrambled eggs to future senators and ladled soup for tomorrow's CEOs, invisible in her uniform, present but unnoticed in their carefully curated world. The students knew her only as a friendly face behind the serving line. Some of the kinder ones said please and thank you. A few regulars had learned her name over the years, mostly the international students who seemed less infected by the peculiar American ability to see service workers as background noise. But to most, Maria was simply part of the Harvard experience, as unremarkable as the brick pathways or the ivy climbing the residence hall walls. What none of them knew was that Maria Santos possessed one of the sharpest economic minds of her generation. While she served their breakfast, she mentally calculated supply chain inefficiencies in the dining hall operations. As she wiped tables, she observed behavioral patterns that would make microeconomics professors weep with envy. During her 15-minute breaks, she would slip into empty classrooms and read discarded textbooks, absorbing complex theories about market dynamics and consumer behavior that she had been applying instinctively her entire life. Growing up in El Salvador, Maria had been the daughter of a street vendor who sold handmade crafts to tourists. By age 12, she was helping her father negotiate prices, understanding intuitively how desperation affected bargaining power, how scarcity drove demand, how the psychology of the buyer influenced every transaction. She had learned economics not from textbooks, but from empty stomachs and overdue rent, from watching her mother stretch $1 until it screamed for mercy. When her family immigrated to Boston when she was 16, Maria had been forced to abandon her education to work, but her mind never stopped calculating, analyzing, questioning the invisible forces that governed the world around her. The discovery happened on a Tuesday in October, during the lunch rush, when the dining hall thundered with the voices of 1,000 hungry students. Maria was stationed at the pasta bar, mechanically serving portions of penne and marinara sauce, when she overheard a heated discussion at the nearby table. 4 students huddled around laptops and notebooks, their voices tight with frustration and panic. "This is impossible," muttered James Chen, a junior whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels across Asia. Professor Blackwood's assignment makes no sense. How are we supposed to model consumer behavior in a market that doesn't exist? His study partner, Alexandria Worthington, whose trust fund could buy a small country, pushed her designer glasses up her nose with a manicured finger. "I've read every textbook twice. I've hired 3 different tutors. Nothing is working. My family has attended Harvard for 5 generations, and I'm going to be the first one to fail out." The third student, Marcus Johnson, a scholarship kid from Detroit who had fought his way into Harvard through academic excellence and sheer determination, shook his head grimly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe Professor Blackwood wants us to fail. You know what they call her class, right? The graveyard. 97% failure rate. She's destroyed more academic careers than grade inflation." The 4th member of their group, Sarah Kim, whose parents owned a successful tech startup, slammed her laptop shut in frustration. "The assignment is asking us to predict market reactions to government policy changes in 3 different economic models simultaneously. But the parameters keep shifting, and every time we think we've found a solution, we realize we're missing variables we didn't even know existed." Maria found herself slowing her serving pace, listening despite herself. The students were discussing Professor Katherine Blackwood's infamous Economics 201 midterm project, a theoretical challenge that had been crushing Harvard's brightest minds for over 2 decades. As she spooned sauce over pasta, Maria's brain began working through the problem they were describing. 3 economic models, shifting parameters, unknown variables, government policy impacts, consumer behavior predictions. Her mind started connecting dots that the students couldn't see. The error in their approach wasn't mathematical, it was philosophical. They were treating the 3 economic models as separate entities instead of recognizing them as interconnected systems influenced by human psychology and political reality. Maria had watched these exact dynamics play out in her own community for years. When immigration policies shifted, it affected not just the documented workers, but the entire informal economy. When minimum wage discussions heated up, it changed. Spending patterns months before any legislation passed. The students were looking for mathematical precision in a world governed by emotional reaction and political theater. "Excuse me," Maria said quietly, approaching their table during a brief lull in the lunch line. The 4 students looked up, surprised that the cafeteria worker was addressing them directly. James frowned slightly. "Is there a problem with our table?" No problem," Maria replied, her slight accent more pronounced when she was nervous. "I just couldn't help overhearing about your project. You're working on the Blackwood assignment, yes?" Alexandria's eyebrows rose. "You know Professor Blackwood?" Maria smiled. "I know of her, very tough teacher, but I think maybe you're approaching the problem from the wrong direction." The students exchanged glances. Marcus, who had grown up around working-class people and maintained more humility than his classmates, leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Maria glanced around nervously, aware that she was stepping far outside her role. "You're trying to solve 3 separate economic models, but they're not separate. They're the same model viewed from 3 different perspectives, like looking at a building from the front, the side, and from above. It's still the same building." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I don't understand." "The government policy changes," Maria continued, her confidence growing as she warmed to the subject. "They don't create 3 different market reactions. They create one reaction that appears different depending on which part of the market you're examining. The key is to find the underlying human behavior that drives all three perspectives. James scoffed. With all due respect, this is graduate-level economic theory. It's not exactly intuitive. Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained calm. You're right. It's not intuitive if you've only studied it in books. But if you've lived it, if you've watched how real people make economic decisions, when their survival depends on it, the patterns become clear. Alexandria leaned back in her chair. And you think you understand these patterns? I think, Maria said carefully, that your professor designed this assignment to be unsolvable using traditional economic theory because traditional economic theory assumes people make rational decisions. But people don't make rational decisions. They make emotional decisions and then rationalize them afterward. If you account for the emotional drivers beneath the economic behaviors, the three models align. The table fell silent. Finally, Marcus spoke. Can you show us what you mean? Maria looked around the dining hall, suddenly aware that she had been away from her station too long. I have to get back to work, but maybe if you're still working on this tonight, I could take a look during my break. The students exchanged another round of glances. Finally, Alexandria nodded. We'll be in the library, 3rd floor, study room C. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Around 9 p.m. Maria nodded and hurried back to the pasta station, her heart pounding. She had just offered to help Harvard students with their economics homework. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was a cafeteria worker, without a college degree, volunteering to assist some of the most privileged young people in America with graduate-level coursework. But as she resumed serving pasta, she couldn't shake the conviction that she understood something they were missing, something that couldn't be learned from textbooks or purchased with tutoring sessions. That evening, after Maria had served dinner, cleaned the dining hall and taken the subway home to check on her daughters, she returned to Harvard's library with a notebook she had bought at the dollar store and a mechanical pencil worn smooth from years of use. The Widener Library at night felt like a different universe from the bustling dining hall. Students moved through the corridors with the hushed reverence of pilgrims, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of laptop screens. Maria found study, room C on the 3rd floor, where the 4 students sat surrounded by mountains of textbooks, empty coffee cups, and the unmistakable aura of academic desperation. When she knocked softly on the glass door, James looked up with surprise, as if he had forgotten their arrangement. "You actually came," he said, opening the door. "I said I would," Maria replied, stepping into the small room that smelled of stress, sweat, and determination. Marcus gestured to an empty chair. "We've been working on this for 6 hours since lunch. We're not any closer to a solution." Maria settled into the chair and looked at their work spread across the table. Pages of equations, graphs, charts, theoretical models that spiraled into increasing complexity without approaching clarity. She picked up one of their draft attempts and studied it silently. "The math is correct," she said finally. "But you're solving the wrong problem." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean we're following the assignment parameters exactly?" "You're following the parameters," Maria agreed. "But you're not answering the question Professor Blackwood is actually asking." She reached for a blank piece of paper and drew 3 overlapping circles. "You see this as 3 separate problems requiring 3 separate solutions. But look at the assignment again. Look at the exact wording." Alexandria pulled up the assignment on her laptop and read aloud. "Model consumer behavior responses to proposed government policy changes across 3 economic frameworks, accounting for market volatility and demographic variables." "Right there," Maria said, pointing to the screen. Consumer behavior responses, not consumer behaviors. Response, singular. She's asking you to find the one response that manifests differently across the three frameworks. The student stared at her. James shook his head. That's impossible. Consumer responses to policy changes vary enormously depending on income, level, education, geographic location, age, political affiliation. Exactly, Maria said with a smile. But underneath all those variables, there's one constant: fear. She began writing on the paper, her handwriting neat despite the cheap pencil. People respond to policy uncertainty with fear. Fear of losing what they have, or fear of missing out on what they might gain. The three economic frameworks you're analyzing, they're just different ways that fear expresses itself in market behavior. Marcus leaned forward. Go on. Framework 1, microeconomic individual choice theory. When people are afraid, they make conservative decisions. They save instead of spend. They choose familiar brands over new options. They avoid risk. Framework 2, macroeconomic market dynamics. When enough individuals make conservative choices simultaneously, it creates predictable patterns in market behavior. Framework 3, behavioral economics and policy impact. When governments recognize these patterns, they adjust policies to either amplify or counteract the fear response. Maria looked up at the four faces staring at her. The assignment isn't asking you to predict three different outcomes. It's asking you to trace how one human emotion cascades through three levels of economic analysis. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the building's heating system. Finally, Sarah spoke. How do we model fear? Maria smiled. That's the beautiful part. You don't model fear itself. You model the behaviors that fear produces, and you adjust the intensity based on the magnitude of the policy change and the vulnerability of the affected population. For the next 3 hours, Maria guided the students through a complete reconceptualization of their approach. She showed them how to identify fear-based decision patterns in historical economic data. She taught them to recognize the mathematical signatures of collective anxiety in market fluctuations. She helped them understand that the variables they had been treating as random noise were actually predictable responses to different types of uncertainty. By midnight, they had the foundation of a solution that none of them had imagined 6 hours earlier. The students looked at Maria with a mixture of awe and confusion, struggling to reconcile the woman who served their lunch with the economic mind that had just unraveled a problem that had stumped them for weeks. "Where did you learn this?" Alexandria asked finally. Maria was quiet for a long moment. "My father sold crafts to tourists in El Salvador. When the Civil War got bad, fewer tourists came. When American foreign policy shifted, it affected how safe Americans felt about traveling to Central America, which affected how many tourists came, which affected whether my family ate that week. I learned to read the signs, to predict how political changes would ripple through our tiny piece of the economy." She gathered her notes. Economics isn't just theory, it's survival, and survival teaches you things that textbooks can't. As Maria prepared to leave, Marcus called after her. "Will you help us finish this? We still have to write the full analysis and create the predictive models." Maria paused at the door. "This is your education, your assignment. I was just helping you see the forest instead of getting lost in the trees." "But we need more than just the concept," James said. "We need to execute it properly, and honestly, you understand this material better than any of us." Maria looked at the four students, recognizing something she hadn't expected to see in their faces. Not just gratitude, but respect. For the first time in 7 years of working at Harvard, she felt truly seen. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll help you finish it." What none of them knew was that Professor Katherine Blackwood had been watching. She had noticed patterns in library access logs that intrigued her. She had heard whispers from students about unconventional study groups, and she had begun to suspect that someone was teaching her students to think about economics in ways that transcended everything she had tried to accomplish in her 23 years of terrorizing Harvard's brightest minds. The discovery was about to become something much larger than a late-night tutoring session. It was about to become a reckoning with everything Harvard thought it knew about intelligence, education, and the value of lived experience versus academic pedigree. Word traveled fast in Harvard's insular academic ecosystem. By Thursday morning, whispered conversations echoed through the corridors of the economics department about the impossible midterm project that had suddenly become possible. Students who had been resigned to failure were now cautiously optimistic, their solutions bearing the unmistakable fingerprints of an approach that none of their professors had ever taught. Professor Katherine Blackwood noticed the shift immediately. In her 23 years of teaching Economics 201, she had never seen students submit work that demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of the psychological underpinnings of market behavior. The mathematical frameworks were familiar, but the insights that drove them were revolutionary. Someone was teaching her students to think like economists instead of merely calculating like accountants. Maria Santos had no idea that her midnight tutoring session would transform into something far more complex and dangerous. She arrived at work Friday morning expecting to return to her routine of serving breakfast and wiping tables, but instead found herself at the center of an academic mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. The first sign that something had changed came during the morning rush. As Maria spooned scrambled eggs onto plates, she noticed students pointing in her direction, their voices carrying fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. She caught words like genius and impossible and cafeteria. Lady, each phrase hitting her like small stones thrown by invisible hands. Sarah Kim approached the serving station with her usual breakfast tray, but instead of the polite nod Maria typically received, Sarah paused and spoke directly to her. Maria, I wanted to thank you again for Tuesday night. We submitted our project yesterday, and I think it might actually be good. Maria smiled nervously, aware that other students in line were listening. I'm glad I could help a little. A little. Sarah's voice carried genuine amazement. You completely revolutionized how we understood the entire assignment. Our study group has been telling everyone about your approach. The words sent a chill through Maria's chest. She had helped 4 students with their homework, nothing more. She hadn't intended to become the subject of campus gossip or academic speculation. As Sarah moved away from the serving line, Maria noticed other students watching her with curious expressions, as if seeing her for the first time, despite her 7 years of daily presence in their lives. The morning passed with unusual tension. Maria found herself hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered conversation, every moment when students seemed to be discussing her rather than simply ignoring her existence. During her break, she retreated to the small employee break room behind the kitchen, where she sat alone with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she tried to process what was happening. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Miss Santos, this is Marcus Johnson from Tuesday night. Professor Blackwood wants to meet with you. Can you come to her office today after your shift? Room 315, Litauer Center. Maria stared at the message until the words blurred. Professor Katherine Blackwood, the woman whose reputation for academic brutality was legendary even among Harvard's notoriously demanding faculty, wanted to meet with a cafeteria worker. The absurdity of the situation would have been comical if it weren't so terrifying. She texted back, "Why does she want to see me?" Marcus's response came quickly. "She knows you helped us. She wants to talk about your approach to the assignment. Maria's hands trembled as she set down the phone. She had crossed a line without realizing it, stepped into a world where she didn't belong and where her presence might have consequences she hadn't considered. The safe invisibility she had maintained for 7 years was dissolving, replaced by a visibility that felt dangerous and unpredictable. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of anxiety. Maria served lunch mechanically, her mind racing through possible scenarios for her meeting with Professor Blackwood. Would she be accused of academic dishonesty? Would the professor assume she had somehow obtained unauthorized access to answer keys or previous solutions? Would her job be in jeopardy because she had overstepped the boundaries that separated service workers from the academic community? At 3:30, Maria clocked out and walked across campus to the Littauer Center, where Harvard housed its economics department. The building felt imposing in a way that the dining hall never did, its neoclassical architecture designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Students and faculty moved through the corridors with the confident bearing of people who belonged, while Maria felt like an intruder, dressed in civilian clothes, but still wearing the invisible uniform of her service job. Room 315 was located on the 3rd floor, behind a heavy wooden door marked with a simple brass nameplate, Professor K. Blackwood. Maria knocked twice, her knuckles barely making sound against the solid wood. "Enter," came a voice from within. Maria opened the door to find herself in an office that looked like the physical manifestation of intellectual intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with academic journals, economic treatises, and volumes in languages Maria couldn't identify. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers, multiple computer monitors, and what appeared to be mathematical equations written in different colored inks. Professor Katherine Blackwood sat behind the desk, a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair pulled into a precise bun and eyes that seemed to catalog and analyze everything they observed. She wore a charcoal gray blazer and an expression of clinical curiosity, like a scientist examining an unexpected specimen. "Ms. Santos," Professor Blackwood said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Please sit." Maria settled into the chair, which was less comfortable than it appeared, and positioned to place her slightly lower than the professor. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I've been teaching economics at Harvard for 23 years, Professor Blackwood began, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone accustomed to being listened to. "In that time, I have worked with some of the most brilliant young minds in the world. Students who arrive here having already mastered advanced mathematical concepts, who have been groomed for academic excellence since kindergarten, who possess every advantage that privilege and preparation can provide." Maria nodded, unsure whether a response was expected. "My midterm project is designed to be nearly impossible," the professor continued. "It requires not just mathematical skill, but conceptual thinking that transcends traditional economic theory. Most students fail because they cannot make the leap from academic knowledge to intuitive understanding. They can memorize formulas, but they cannot perceive the human behaviors that make those formulas relevant." Professor Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "This week, I received 4 assignments that demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking I have been trying to cultivate for over 2 decades. Not just correct answers, but revolutionary approaches to fundamental questions about human economic behavior. The mathematical work was competent, but the insights were extraordinary." Maria's mouth felt dry. "Professor, I only helped them see the problem differently. They did all the real work." "Ms. Santos," Professor Blackwood's voice carried a note of gentle correction. "I have read their work. The mathematical calculations belong to them, but the conceptual framework is yours. You taught them to understand economics as a behavioral science rather than a mathematical exercise. You showed them how to identify emotional patterns in market data. You helped them recognize that economic theory without psychological insight is merely elaborate arithmetic. The professor opened a folder on her desk and removed several sheets of paper. Tell me about your educational background. Maria's heart sank. This was the moment when her lack of credentials would end the conversation and confirm that she had no business inserting herself into Harvard's academic world. I finished high school in El Salvador, but I had to leave when my family immigrated. I've been working since I was 16. No college coursework, no formal economics training. No, ma'am. Just books I've read on my own and paying attention to how the world works. Professor Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, studying Maria with an expression that was impossible to read. Miss Santos, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you understand that what you taught those students represents graduate-level economic theory that most PhD candidates struggle to master? Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks. I wasn't trying to teach theory. I was just sharing what I've observed. What you've observed, the professor repeated slowly, represents some of the most sophisticated economic thinking I've encountered. In my career, the integration of behavioral psychology with market dynamics, the recognition of fear as a quantifiable variable in economic modeling, the understanding that policy impacts cascade through different analytical frameworks while maintaining consistent underlying patterns. These are not casual observations, Miss Santos. These are revolutionary insights. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Maria stared at her hands, struggling to process what she was hearing. The woman she had grown up believing herself to be, a high school dropout whose intellectual value was limited to serving food and cleaning tables, was being described as an economic theorist by one of Harvard's most respected professors. I don't understand, Maria said quietly. If what I think is so valuable, why am I working in a cafeteria? Professor Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Because our educational system is designed to recognize and cultivate certain types of intelligence while ignoring others. Because economic theory has become so divorced from economic reality that we train students to manipulate equations without understanding the human behaviors those equations represent. Because institutional barriers prevent people like you from accessing the platforms where your insights could be shared and developed. She paused, then continued. Mrs. Santos, I believe you possess one of the most intuitive economic minds I have ever encountered. The question is what we do with that gift. Maria looked up. What do you mean? I mean that I would like to offer you an opportunity, not charity, not sympathy, but recognition of intellectual ability that deserves development and application. Professor Blackwood opened another folder. Harvard offers a continuing education program for working adults. The coursework is rigorous, but it's designed for people who cannot attend traditional classes due to work and family obligations. Classes meet in the evenings and on weekends. Financial aid is available for qualified applicants. Maria's breath caught. You're suggesting I go back to school? I'm suggesting you belong in school. I'm suggesting that your insights into economic behavior are too valuable to remain confined to midnight tutoring sessions. I'm suggesting that Harvard needs to learn from you as much as you might learn from Harvard. The professor slid a packet of papers across the desk. These are preliminary application materials. The program requires placement testing, but given what I've observed of your analytical abilities, I believe you would qualify for advanced placement in several areas. Maria stared at the papers without touching them. Professor, I'm 42 years old. I have 2 daughters to support. I work full-time. I haven't been in a classroom in over 25 years. All true, Professor Blackwood agreed. Also irrelevant. Intelligence doesn't expire, Ms. Santos. Insight doesn't diminish with age. Your life experience has given you perspectives on economic reality that traditional students lack. Those perspectives are precisely what economic education needs. Maria finally reached for the papers, her hands shaking slightly. What would I study? That would be up to you, but I would recommend a focus on behavioral economics with coursework, in statistical analysis and economic policy. Your intuitive understanding of market psychology could be developed into formal research that might influence how economic theory is taught and applied. The weight of the possibility settled over Maria like a blanket that was simultaneously comforting and suffocating. For 7 years, she had accepted that her intellectual life was limited to stolen moments, with discarded textbooks and overheard lectures. The idea that she might legitimately belong in Harvard's academic community felt both thrilling and impossible. "Can I think about it?" Maria asked. "Of course. But Ms. Santos, I want you to understand something. What happened this week with those 4 students was not an accident. You didn't stumble into helping them. You recognized a problem that you were uniquely qualified to solve, and you solved it with elegance and insight. That is what scholars do. That is what you are, whether or not you have the credentials to prove it." Maria left Professor Blackwood's office with the application materials clutched against her chest and her mind spinning with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. The walk back across campus felt different, as if the familiar pathways had been transformed into something new and potentially accessible. That evening, after Maria had fed her daughters dinner and helped them with their homework, she sat at her kitchen table with the application packets spread before her. The language was intimidating, filled with academic jargon and requirements that seemed designed for people whose lives looked nothing like hers. But between the formal phrases and institutional expectations, she could see the outline of a possibility that both terrified and excited her. Her daughter Carmen, a senior in high school who had inherited her mother's sharp mind and determination, looked over her shoulder at the papers. "Mom, is this for college?" Maria nodded. "Maybe. I don't know yet." "Harvard?" Carmen's voice carried disbelief. "The place where you work. It's a program for adults who work. Evening classes, weekend classes. It would take years to finish." Carmen sat down beside her mother. "What would you study?" "Economics. How money and markets work. How people make decisions about buying and selling. How government policies affect regular people." "You already know about that stuff," Carmen pointed out. "You've been explaining it to me since I was little. Remember when you taught me why gas prices go up before holidays and down after elections?" Maria smiled. "That's different from studying it in school." "Is it? Mom, you've been teaching yourself this stuff for years. You read every economics book you can find. You watch the news and predict what's going to happen to prices and jobs. You help those college kids with their homework because you understand things they don't." Carmen picked up one of the application forms. "Maybe it's time other people learned from you instead of you always learning from them." Over the next week, Maria found herself caught between 2 worlds that seemed incompatible. During the day, she served food and cleaned tables, maintaining the familiar routine that had defined her life for 7 years. But during breaks and quiet moments, she studied the application materials, researching course descriptions and imagining herself in classrooms where she would be a student rather than an invisible service provider. The transformation was not without complications. Word had spread through the student population about the cafeteria worker who had helped solve Professor Blackwood's impossible assignment. Some students approached Maria with curiosity and respect, asking questions about economics and seeking her perspective on their coursework. Others viewed her with suspicion or amusement, unable to reconcile their assumptions about service workers with evidence of intellectual capability. One afternoon, while Maria was restocking napkin dispensers, she overheard a conversation between two graduate students that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "It's probably a publicity stunt," one of them said dismissively. "Harvard loves these feel-good stories about discovering hidden genius in unexpected places. Makes them look egalitarian and socially conscious." "But I heard she actually understood the material," the other student replied. "Like really understood it, not just memorized answers." "Please, a high school dropout who serves lunch is going to revolutionize economic theory. The whole thing is ridiculous. She probably had help, or someone fed her the answers, or it's all been exaggerated by students who want to believe in fairy tales." Maria turned away, her face burning with embarrassment and anger. The comments crystallized fears she had been trying to suppress since her meeting with Professor Blackwood. Maybe she was deluding herself. Maybe her insights were obvious rather than revolutionary. Maybe she was being set up for public humiliation when her lack of formal education inevitably exposed itself. That evening, she called Professor Blackwood's office and left a voicemail declining the application opportunity. She was grateful for the encouragement, she said, but she had decided that returning to school wasn't practical given her circumstances. Professor Blackwood called her back within an hour. "Miss Santos, I received your message and I'd like to schedule another meeting. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" "Professor, I've made my decision. I understand, but I'd like to discuss some additional information that might be relevant to your decision-making process. Can you spare 30 minutes? The next day, Maria reluctantly returned to Professor Blackwood's office, prepared for a conversation that would politely but firmly close the door on an opportunity that had been too good to be true. Instead, she found herself facing a woman whose expression combined determination with something that looked remarkably like maternal protectiveness. "Ms. Santos, before you make a final decision about the continuing education program, I'd like you to know about a conversation I had with the Dean of Admissions yesterday." Professor Blackwood opened a file folder. "I shared examples of your analytical work with several colleagues in the economics department without identifying you initially. I wanted their professional assessment of the theoretical frameworks you developed." She removed several sheets of paper. "Professor Richardson, who teaches behavioral economics, described your approach as groundbreaking. Professor Chen, our specialist in market psychology, said your integration of emotional variables into economic modeling was precisely the kind of innovative thinking the field needs. Professor Martinez, who studies policy impact analysis, called your work revolutionary." Maria stared at the papers. They didn't know the work came from me. Not initially. When I revealed that the insights came from a self-taught cafeteria worker rather than a graduate student or faculty member, their responses were illuminating. Not skepticism, Miss Santos, excitement. They want to meet you. They want to understand how you develop these perspectives. They want to learn from you. The professor leaned forward. "The Dean of Admissions has agreed to waive the usual placement. Testing requirements based on the work samples I provided. You would be admitted directly into advanced coursework with full financial aid coverage. Your evening work schedule would be accommodated. Childcare assistance would be provided when needed." Maria felt the familiar sensation of her world tilting off its axis. "Why are you doing this?" "Because transformative ideas can come from anywhere, and it's Harvard's responsibility to recognize and nurture them regardless of their source. Because the economic challenges facing our society require perspectives that can't be found in traditional academic backgrounds. Because you have something to teach that our students and faculty need to learn." Professor Blackwood stood and walked to her bookshelf, removing a thick volume. This is a collection of economic papers that changed how the field understood market behavior. Most were written by people with impressive credentials and traditional academic careers. But the most influential ones came from thinkers who approached economics from unconventional angles, who brought life experience that challenged academic assumptions. She handed the book to Maria. Your perspective on economic behavior is shaped by survival, by watching how real people make financial decisions under pressure, by understanding poverty and struggle in ways that most economists never will. That perspective is not a limitation, Ms. Santos. It's your greatest strength. Maria opened the book and found a bookmark marking a specific essay. The title read, Economic Theory and Human Reality, Bridging the Gap Between Academic Models and Lived Experience. The author of that essay revolutionized how we understand consumer behavior, Professor Blackwood explained. She was a single mother who worked as a bank teller while putting herself through college. Her insights into economic decision-making came from watching working-class customers navigate financial choices that middle-class economists had never faced. Maria looked up. What happened to her? She became one of the most influential economic theorists of the 20th century. She changed how we understand the relationship between psychology and economics. She proved that the most powerful economic insights often come from people who have lived the realities that economists try to model. Professor Blackwood returned to her desk. Ms. Santos, I'm not offering you charity or making accommodations out of sympathy. I'm recognizing intellectual ability that could transform how economics is taught and understood. The question is, whether you're willing to take the risk of believing in yourself as much as I believe in you. Maria sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of decision pressing against her chest like a physical force. Finally, she spoke. If I do this, if I try and fail, what happens then? Then you will have tried something extraordinary, and that attempt will have been valuable regardless of the outcome. But Ms. Santos, I don't believe you will fail. I believe you will exceed expectations in ways that will surprise everyone, including yourself. Maria closed the book and looked directly at Professor Blackwood. Okay, I'll try. The professor smiled, and for the first time since Maria had met her, the expression seemed genuinely warm rather than clinically professional. Excellent. We'll start with placement interviews next week to determine which courses would be most appropriate for your first semester. As Maria prepared to leave, Professor Blackwood added one final comment. Ms. Santos, you're about to discover that academic success isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to think differently than everyone else in the room, and that you already know how to do. Walking back across campus that evening, Maria felt the familiar Harvard pathways beneath her feet. But this time, they led toward a future she had never dared to imagine. The cafeteria worker was about to become a student, and the student was about to discover just how much she had always been a scholar. The first semester of Maria's academic journey unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance between triumph and terror. She attended her first economics seminar on a cold Tuesday evening in February, walking into a classroom where she was simultaneously the oldest student and the most nervous. Her classmates were a mix of working professionals seeking career advancement and recent graduates pursuing specialized knowledge, but none carried the weight of wondering whether they fundamentally belonged in an academic setting. Maria had spent the week before classes began reading every assigned text twice, taking notes in margins that grew crowded with her own questions and observations. She arrived early to each session, sitting in the back row with notebooks that she kept meticulously organized and pens that she gripped too tightly during discussions. The material itself felt familiar, like conversations she had been having with herself for years, but the language of academic discourse was foreign territory that required careful navigation. Professor Janet Woodward, who taught the introductory behavioral economics course, noticed Maria immediately, not because she stood out, but because she disappeared so completely into quiet attention, while other students dominated discussions with confident assertions and theoretical name-dropping. Maria listened with an intensity that seemed to absorb every word spoken in the room. When she did contribute to conversations, her comments carried a weight that made everyone pause and reconsider. 3 weeks into the semester, during a discussion about consumer decision-making under economic stress, Maria finally found her voice. The class was debating a case study about shopping patterns during recession periods, with most students offering predictable analyses based on standard economic models. "The problem with this analysis," Maria said quietly, speaking for the first time that evening, "is that it assumes people have choices." The room turned toward her. Professor Woodward nodded encouragingly. "Can you elaborate on that observation?" Maria took a breath, feeling the familiar sensation of stepping onto intellectual ground that felt both dangerous and necessary. The case study talks about consumers choosing between name brand and generic products during economic downturns, but it frames the decision as a preference rather than a survival strategy. When you're choosing between feeding your family and paying rent, you're not making consumer choices in the way these models suggest. You're making triage decisions. A student named David, whose confidence suggested a background in business consulting, shook his head, but the mathematical models show clear correlations between income reduction and spending pattern changes. The choice framework is still valid even if the circumstances are constrained. Maria looked at him directly. "The models work if you're studying spreadsheets. They fall apart when you're living the decisions they're trying to predict. When you have $40 to last until payday and your child needs medicine, you're not weighing brand preferences, you're calculating survival. The emotional and psychological factors that drive those decisions can't be captured by correlation analysis alone." Professor Woodward leaned forward. "What would you suggest as an alternative analytical approach?" Start with the constraints instead of the choices," Maria replied. "Map the actual decision tree that people face when resources are limited. Factor in the psychological cost of each decision, not just the financial cost. Recognize that consumer behavior under economic stress follows patterns that look irrational from the outside, but make perfect sense when you understand the full context of people's lives." The discussion that followed was unlike anything Professor Woodward had witnessed in 12 years of teaching behavioral economics. Maria's perspective shifted the entire framework of analysis, forcing her classmates to reconsider fundamental assumptions about economic decision-making. By the end of the session, the case study had been completely reconceptualized, not through theoretical innovation, but through the application of lived experience to academic analysis. After class, several students approached Maria with questions and comments. David, whose initial skepticism had given way to genuine curiosity, asked how she had developed such insights into economic behavior under stress. "Experience," Maria replied simply. 25 years of making decisions with incomplete information and insufficient resources." Word began to spread through Harvard's economics department about the extraordinary student in Professor Woodward's evening seminar. Faculty members started attending her sessions as observers, curious about the woman who was challenging established analytical frameworks with insights that seemed to emerge from intuition rather than traditional academic training. Professor Blackwood, who had been monitoring Maria's progress from a respectful distance, began receiving reports that exceeded even her optimistic expectations. Maria wasn't just succeeding in her coursework, she was transforming how her classmates and professors thought about economic theory itself. But success at Harvard came with scrutiny that Maria hadn't anticipated. As her reputation grew within the economics department, questions began to emerge about her background, her qualifications, and the legitimacy of her analytical insights. The same institutional barriers that had kept her invisible for 7 years now threatened to undermine her newly discovered visibility. The crisis began with an anonymous email sent to the graduate student newspaper, the Harvard Review. The message, which would later be traced to a disgruntled doctoral candidate whose own research had been overshadowed by discussions of Maria's work, raised questions about academic standards and institutional integrity. Harvard's economics department is celebrating a cafeteria worker as a revolutionary thinker, the email read. While her personal story may be inspiring, the university's willingness to grant academic credibility to someone without proper educational credentials sets a dangerous precedent. Are we lowering academic standards in pursuit of feel-good publicity? The newspaper's editor, an ambitious junior named Timothy Chen, who saw potential for a controversial story that might gain national attention, decided to investigate. Within days, Maria found herself at the center of a campus-wide debate about merit, credentials, and the purpose of higher education. The article, titled "The Cafeteria Scholar: Inspiration or Academic Compromise," appeared in the Harvard Review on a Thursday morning and immediately ignited fierce discussions across campus. The piece questioned whether Harvard was promoting Maria's insights based on their intellectual merit or their inspirational narrative. It suggested that her lack of formal academic training made her contributions fundamentally different from those of traditionally educated scholars, regardless of their quality. Maria first learned about the article when her daughter Carmen called her during her morning shift at the dining hall. Carmen had seen the story shared on social media by Harvard students, and her voice carried a mix of anger and concern that made Maria's chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "Mom, people are saying terrible things online. They're calling you a fraud and saying Harvard is just using you for publicity." Maria set down the serving spoon she had been holding and stepped away from the breakfast line. What exactly are they saying? That you don't really understand economics, that professors are just being nice to you, that you're taking spots away from qualified students. Mom, some of these comments are really cruel. The rest of Maria's shift passed in a haze of humiliation and self-doubt. Students who had previously treated her with newfound respect now seemed to be examining her with skeptical eyes, as if looking for evidence to support or refute the newspaper's insinuations. The comfortable invisibility she had, once taken for granted, was gone, replaced by a visibility that felt harsh and unforgiving. During her break, Maria read the full article on her phone, each paragraph cutting deeper than the last. The piece didn't directly call her a fraud, but it raised questions about academic integrity that felt like accusations. It quoted anonymous sources within the economics department who suggested that Maria's contributions were being overvalued due to their novelty rather than their scholarly merit. There's a difference between interesting insights and rigorous academic analysis, one unnamed professor was quoted as saying. We have to be careful not to confuse compelling personal narratives with intellectual achievement. The article concluded with a pointed question that seemed designed to undermine everything Maria had accomplished. In an era when higher education faces criticism for elitism, is Harvard genuinely committed to expanding access to diverse perspectives, or is it simply seeking positive publicity through the promotion of an inspiring but ultimately unqualified outsider? Maria's evening seminar that night was unlike any she had previously attended. The usual collegial atmosphere was replaced by a tension that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. Some students offered supportive comments and defended her contributions to class discussions. Others remained conspicuously silent, their body language suggesting discomfort with the controversy surrounding their classmate. Professor Woodward addressed the situation directly at the beginning of class. "I'm aware that there has been discussion about one of our students in the campus newspaper. I want to be clear that every person in this room earned their place here through demonstrated intellectual ability, and every contribution to our discussions will be evaluated based on its analytical merit, not on the background of the person who offers it." Despite the professor's statement, the evening felt different. When Maria spoke during discussions, her comments seemed to carry extra weight, as if they were being evaluated not just for their insight, but for their legitimacy. The natural flow of intellectual exchange was disrupted by the awareness that every word Maria uttered might be scrutinized as evidence for or against her academic credibility. After class, Maria approached Professor Woodward with a request that had been forming in her mind throughout the evening. "Professor, I think it might be better if I withdrew from the program. The controversy is becoming a distraction for other students and for the department." Professor Woodward's expression hardened. "Miss Santos, are you suggesting that you should abandon your education because some people are uncomfortable with your success?" "I'm suggesting that maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe my insights aren't as valuable as I thought they were." "Do you believe that?" Maria was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what I believe anymore." Professor Woodward gathered her materials and gestured for Maria to walk with her toward the parking lot. As they moved through the evening air, she spoke with the measured tone of someone who had given considerable thought to her words. "Ms. Santos, in my 12 years of teaching economics, I have worked with hundreds of students. Most of them are intelligent, hardworking, and capable of mastering the material I present. But very few of them have the ability to fundamentally reframe how we understand economic behavior. Your contributions to our discussions haven't just been insightful, they've been transformative." They reached Professor Woodward's car, but she made no move to unlock it. Instead, she turned to face Maria directly. "The controversy surrounding your presence here isn't really about your qualifications. It's about institutional gatekeeping, about who gets to be considered an intellectual authority and who gets to participate in academic discourse. There are people who are threatened by the idea that profound insights into economic behavior might come from someone who learned economics through survival rather than through textbooks." Maria stared at the ground. "Maybe they're right to be threatened. Maybe I'm taking opportunities away from more qualified people." "More qualified?" Professor Woodward's voice carried sharp edges. "Ms. Santos, you have spent 25 years conducting field research on economic decision-making under real-world constraints. You have observed consumer behavior patterns that most economists only encounter in theoretical models. You have developed analytical frameworks that challenge fundamental assumptions in our field. In what sense are you less qualified than students who have read about economics in libraries but never lived it in reality?" The professor unlocked her car but didn't get in. "I'm going to share something with you that I've never told any student. When I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I spent 3 years developing a theoretical model for consumer behavior during economic uncertainty. The model was mathematically elegant, peer-reviewed, and completely wrong. It took me 2 years of post-graduation research to realize that my assumptions about human behavior were fundamentally flawed because I had never experienced the economic uncertainty I was trying to model." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your insights into economic behavior are valuable precisely because they come from experience rather than theory. That's not a limitation, Ms. Santos. That's your strength. And if Harvard's economics department isn't sophisticated enough to recognize that strength, the problem lies with the department, not with you. The conversation with Professor Woodward provided some comfort, but it didn't resolve the larger crisis that Maria faced. The newspaper article had initiated a campus-wide debate about academic standards and institutional values that showed no signs of diminishing. Letters to the editor appeared daily, some defending Maria's right to participate in Harvard's academic community, and others questioning whether the university was compromising its intellectual integrity. The situation escalated when Professor Blackwood decided to address the controversy directly. She called a special faculty meeting of the economics department to discuss what she termed institutional prejudice disguised as academic standards. The meeting, which was supposed to be confidential, was leaked to the Harvard Review within hours. According to the leaked report, Professor Blackwood had delivered a blistering critique of her colleagues' response to Maria's presence in the department. She had argued that the questioning of Maria's qualifications revealed deep-seated biases about who gets to be considered an intellectual authority. She had challenged the department to examine whether their definition of academic merit was inclusive enough to recognize brilliance that manifested in non-traditional forms. The leaked report quoted Professor Blackwood as saying, "We have a student whose analytical insights are revolutionizing how we understand economic behavior, and instead of celebrating that achievement, we're debating whether she deserves to be here. This isn't about academic standards. This is about intellectual gatekeeping that preserves traditional hierarchies at the expense of transformative thinking." The faculty meeting report appeared in the Harvard Review under the headline, "Economics Professor Defends Controversial Student Attacks Colleagues." The article framed Professor Blackwood's comments as an indictment of Harvard's academic culture and suggested that the department was divided between faculty members who supported Maria's inclusion and those who viewed it as a compromise of institutional standards. Maria learned about the article when Carmen called her again, this time with tears in her voice. "Mom, they're making you sound like some kind of charity case that's causing problems for everyone. People online are being so mean. They're saying, you should be grateful for the opportunity instead of causing trouble." The weight of public scrutiny became unbearable. Maria had sought education as a path toward intellectual recognition and personal growth, but instead found herself at the center of a debate that questioned her fundamental right to participate in academic discourse. The dream of scholarly achievement had transformed into a nightmare of public judgment and institutional conflict. That evening, Maria composed a letter to Professor Blackwood and the department administration. She thanked them for the opportunity to participate in Harvard's continuing education program, but explained that she had decided to withdraw in order to avoid further controversy that might damage the university's reputation or disrupt other students' educational experiences. She never sent the letter. Instead, she found herself walking across campus to the library, where she had spent countless hours reading discarded textbooks and imagining what it might be like to legitimately belong in Harvard's intellectual community. The building was nearly empty at 11 p.m., occupied only by a few dedicated graduate students and the security guards who maintained their silent vigil over the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Maria made her way to the economics section, where she had first discovered the academic language for ideas she had been developing through years of observation and experience. She pulled a familiar volume from the shelf, a comprehensive survey of behavioral economics that she had read 3 times over the past 5 years. As she sat in the same chair where she had taught herself economic theory during stolen moments between work shifts, Maria realized that the debate about her qualifications missed the fundamental point. She wasn't trying to prove that she deserved to be at Harvard. She was trying to prove that economic theory deserved to be connected to economic reality. The insight came to her slowly, like sunrise over a landscape she had been studying in darkness. The controversy wasn't really about her academic credentials or her right to participate in scholarly discourse. It was about the tension between institutional authority and intellectual innovation, between traditional gatekeeping and transformative thinking. Maria opened her notebook and began to write. Not an essay about economic theory, but a letter to herself about the difference between earning recognition and deserving respect. She wrote about the years of invisible intellectual work that had prepared her for visible academic achievement. She wrote about the courage required to claim space in institutions that were designed to exclude people like her. By the time she finished writing, Maria had made a decision. She would not withdraw from the program. She would not apologize for insights that challenged academic assumptions. She would not allow institutional prejudice to drive her away from educational opportunities that she had earned through intellectual merit. The next morning, instead of submitting her withdrawal letter, Maria requested a meeting with Dean Patricia Morrison, the head of Harvard's Continuing Education Division. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving Maria time to prepare what she knew would be the most important presentation of her life. Maria spent the intervening days crafting a comprehensive analysis of the controversy surrounding her enrollment. She researched Harvard's stated commitment to educational diversity and intellectual innovation. She documented the specific contributions she had made to classroom discussions and the positive feedback she had received from professors and classmates. She prepared a detailed response to every criticism that had been raised about her qualifications and her presence in the program. Most importantly, she developed a proposal for addressing the underlying issues that the controversy had revealed. Rather than defending herself against accusations of academic inadequacy, Maria chose to demonstrate the value of non-traditional educational perspectives through concrete examples of intellectual contribution. The meeting with Dean Morrison took place on a Wednesday afternoon in the Dean's office, a space that managed to be both intimidating and welcoming. Dean Morrison, a woman in her late 50s with grey hair and intelligent eyes, had built her career on expanding access to higher education while maintaining academic rigor. Ms. Santos, the dean began, I've been following the discussions about your enrollment in our program with great interest. I understand that the situation has become quite challenging for you. Maria had rehearsed her response, but when the moment came to speak, she found herself setting aside her prepared remarks and speaking from a place of authentic conviction. Dean Morrison, I didn't come to Harvard to prove that I'm as smart as traditionally educated students. I came here to prove that economic theory becomes more powerful when it's informed by economic reality. The controversy about my qualifications has revealed something important about how we think about intellectual authority and academic merit. She opened her notebook and referenced the analysis she had prepared. Over the past month, I've contributed to 13 classroom discussions that have fundamentally reframed how my classmates and professors think about economic behavior. I've introduced analytical frameworks that bridge the gap between theoretical models and real-world applications. I've helped other students understand complex concepts by connecting abstract theory to concrete experience. Maria looked directly at the dean. The question isn't whether I'm qualified to be here. The question is whether Harvard is committed to the kind of intellectual innovation that comes from including perspectives that challenge traditional academic assumptions. Dean Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Maria with an expression that was impossible to read. What would you like to see happen, Ms. Santos? I'd like to see this controversy transformed into an opportunity. Instead of debating whether non-traditional students belong at Harvard, let's demonstrate the value that diverse educational backgrounds bring to academic discourse. Instead of defending my right to be here, let's focus on the contributions I can make while I'm here. Maria pulled out a folder containing her most recent coursework. I've prepared a research proposal that addresses some of the theoretical gaps that our classroom discussions have identified. It's an analysis of economic decision-making patterns among working-class families, based on both statistical research and ethnographic observation. The methodology combines traditional academic research with field experience in ways that neither approach could achieve alone. She handed the proposal to Dean Morrison. This is the kind of scholarship that becomes possible when we expand our definition of intellectual qualification beyond traditional academic credentials. It's not just inclusive, it's innovative. Dean Morrison spent several minutes reviewing the proposal, her eyebrows rising as she read. Finally, she looked up with an expression that combined surprise with genuine respect. Ms. Santos, this is graduate-level research. The methodology is sophisticated, the analysis is rigorous, and the implications are significant. How did you develop this level of scholarly expertise? Maria smiled. 25 years of field research, 5 years of independent study, and 4 months of formal academic training. The combination has given me perspectives that I couldn't have developed through any single educational path. The dean closed the folder and leaned forward. I'm going to make you an offer, Ms. Santos. Rather than continuing with the standard continuing education curriculum, I'd like to invite you to participate in our independent study program. You would work directly with faculty mentors to develop your research interests, with the goal of producing scholarship that contributes to academic discourse in meaningful ways. Maria's breath caught. You're offering me a research position. I'm offering you the opportunity to demonstrate that intellectual merit transcends traditional educational credentials. Your insights into economic behavior are clearly valuable, and Harvard should be supporting your development as a scholar rather than debating your right to be one. The conversation continued for another hour, during which Dean Morrison outlined a program of study that would allow Maria to pursue advanced research while maintaining her work schedule and family responsibilities. The path would be challenging, requiring her to produce original scholarship that would be evaluated by the same standards applied to traditional graduate students. But it would also provide the platform she needed to transform her insights into academic contributions that could influence how economic theory was taught and applied. As Maria left the dean's office, she felt a sense of vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. The controversy that had threatened to drive her away from Harvard had instead created an opportunity to demonstrate the value of intellectual diversity in ways that might benefit future students who arrived at academic institutions through non-traditional paths. The announcement of Maria's transition to independent study status appeared in the Harvard Review the following week, but the tone was markedly different from the earlier articles that had questioned her qualifications. The new piece, titled "Cafeteria Worker Becomes Harvard Researcher," focused on the innovative nature of her proposed research and the university's commitment to recognizing intellectual merit regardless of its source. Professor Blackwood, who had advocated for Maria throughout the controversy, offered a quote that captured the significance of the moment. Ms. Santos represents exactly the kind of scholar Harvard should be cultivating. Her research will contribute to economic theory in ways that traditional academic training alone could never achieve. This isn't about lowering standards, it's about expanding our understanding of what intellectual excellence looks like. The crisis that had threatened to end Maria's academic journey had instead transformed into an opportunity to redefine it. She was no longer a continuing education student trying to prove her worth. She was a research scholar with the institutional support to develop insights that could influence economic theory for years to come. But the most important transformation was personal. Maria had discovered that belonging at Harvard wasn't something she needed to earn through credentials or defend through controversy. It was something she had claimed through intellectual courage and sustained through scholarly contribution. The cafeteria worker had become a researcher, not by changing who she was, but by insisting that who she was had always been enough. Maria's research office was located in the basement of Litauer Center, a windowless space that had previously been used for storage, but had been converted into a workspace that reflected her unique position within Harvard's academic hierarchy. The room contained a desk that had seen better decades, two mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with economic journals that she was slowly working her way through with the systematic determination of someone making up for lost time. But the physical space belied the intellectual revolution that was taking place within those concrete walls. Over the course of 18 months, Maria had transformed from a continuing education student defending her right to belong at Harvard into a research scholar whose work was reshaping how economists understood the relationship between theory and lived experience. Her research project, which had begun as a response to the controversy surrounding her enrollment, had evolved into a comprehensive analysis of economic decision-making patterns among working-class families. The methodology was unprecedented in its integration of statistical analysis with ethnographic observation, combining the rigor of academic research with the insights that could only come from someone who had navigated economic uncertainty as a survival strategy rather than a theoretical exercise. Maria spent her mornings working in the dining hall, serving breakfast to students who now recognized her as both a colleague and a curiosity. Her transformation from invisible service worker to visible scholar had created an unusual dynamic in the space where she had labored in anonymity for 7 years. Some students treated her with respectful deference, others with awkward friendliness, and a few with the slightly uncomfortable awareness that their breakfast was being served by someone whose academic achievements exceeded their own. But it was during her afternoon research hours that Maria felt most authentically herself. Surrounded by data sets and interview transcripts, economic journals and statistical software, she was building something that had never existed before. A bridge between the theoretical frameworks that dominated academic economics and the practical realities that shaped how real people made financial decisions. Her first major breakthrough came while analyzing spending patterns among single-parent households during periods of economic instability. Traditional economic models predicted certain behaviors based on income reduction and resource constraint, but Maria's data revealed patterns that seemed to contradict established theory. Families weren't simply reducing spending proportionally across all categories as theoretical models suggested. Instead, they were making complex prioritization decisions that involved psychological and social factors that traditional economic analysis failed to capture. A mother might continue purchasing name-brand cereal for her children while switching to generic medication for herself, not because of irrational consumer preferences, but because maintaining normalcy for her children took psychological precedence over personal health concerns. Maria recognized these patterns immediately because she had lived them. During the years following her husband's death, she had made countless decisions that would have seemed economically irrational to outside observers, but made perfect sense within the context of her responsibilities as a single mother trying to maintain stability for her daughters while navigating financial crisis. The academic significance of her findings became clear when she presented her preliminary research at a faculty seminar attended by professors from across Harvard's social science departments. The response was immediate and intense. Economists realized that Maria had identified systematic gaps in theoretical models that had been assumed to be comprehensive. Sociologists recognized the implications for understanding class-based behavior patterns. Policy researchers saw applications for government programs designed to support families in economic transition. Professor Blackwood, who had become Maria's primary research mentor, described the presentation as a watershed moment in behavioral economics. Ms. Santos isn't just conducting research, she told colleagues afterward. She's demonstrating how academic theory can be enriched by lived experience in ways that make both the theory and the experience more valuable. The presentation led to invitations from other universities, requests for collaboration from established researchers, and interest from policy organizations seeking to understand how economic support programs could be designed more effectively. Maria found herself transitioning from someone defending her right to participate in academic discourse to someone whose insights were actively sought by scholars and practitioners across multiple fields. But the most significant transformation was happening in Maria's understanding of her own intellectual journey. The years of invisible learning, of reading discarded textbooks and analyzing economic patterns through survival rather than scholarship, hadn't been preparation for academic work. They had been academic work, conducted without institutional recognition, but with the same intellectual rigor that characterized formal research. This realization led to the most ambitious phase of Maria's project: the development of what she termed experiential economics, a methodological approach that systematically integrated lived experience into economic analysis. Rather than treating personal experience as anecdotal evidence to be minimized in favor of statistical data, experiential economics recognized that certain types of economic behavior could only be understood by researchers who had navigated similar circumstances themselves. The methodology was controversial because it challenged fundamental assumptions about objectivity and scholarly distance that had dominated academic research for decades. Traditional economic research emphasized the importance of maintaining analytical detachment from the subjects being studied, while Maria's approach argued that strategic engagement with lived experience could produce insights that detached observation could never achieve. The controversy intensified when Maria submitted her first major research paper to the Journal of Behavioral Economics, one of the most prestigious publications in her field. The paper, titled Beyond Rational Choice: Integrating Survival Psychology into Economic Decision-Making Models, presented a comprehensive framework for understanding how people make financial decisions when their basic security is threatened. The peer review process was unlike anything the journal had previously encountered. Traditional economists praised the rigor of Maria's statistical analysis while questioning the validity of incorporating personal experience into scholarly methodology. Behavioral economists recognized the revolutionary potential of her insights, while debating whether her approach met established standards for academic objectivity. The debate extended beyond the pages of academic journals into conference presentations, faculty discussions, and graduate seminars across the country. Maria found herself at the center of a methodological revolution that was forcing economists to reconsider basic assumptions about how economic knowledge should be produced and validated. The journal's decision to publish Maria's paper, after 8 months of review and revision, represented a significant victory, not just for her individual research, but for the broader principle that academic excellence could emerge from non-traditional educational pathways. The publication was accompanied by commentary from established economists who acknowledged that Maria's work represented a fundamental advance in understanding how economic theory could be enriched by experiential insight. Professor David Chen from MIT wrote, "Santos has accomplished something that behavioral economics has been attempting for decades, the successful integration of psychological reality into economic modeling. Her methodology doesn't compromise scholarly rigor. It enhances it by incorporating data sources that traditional approaches have systematically ignored." Professor Sarah Williams from Stanford added, "This research demonstrates that the most significant advances in economic understanding may come not from increasingly sophisticated mathematical models, but from scholars who bring lived experience to bear on theoretical questions. Santos has opened a new frontier in economic research." The publication of Maria's research coincided with a growing recognition within Harvard's economics department that her presence had catalyzed broader changes in how faculty and students approached their work. Professors began incorporating experiential perspectives into their courses, encouraging students to consider how economic theories manifested in their own lives and communities. Graduate students started pursuing research projects that combined traditional academic methods with ethnographic observation and personal narrative. The rigid boundary between objective analysis and subjective experience that had dominated economic research for generations was being replaced by more nuanced approaches that recognized the value of both perspectives. Maria's influence extended beyond methodology into pedagogy. She began guest lecturing in undergraduate courses, where her ability to connect abstract economic concepts to concrete life experiences made complex theories accessible to students who had previously struggled with the material. Her teaching style was conversational rather than authoritative, inviting students to contribute their own observations and insights rather than simply absorbing information. One of her most popular presentations was titled "The Economics of Everyday Decisions," in which she walked students through the economic principles embedded in routine choices like grocery shopping, apartment hunting, and career planning. Students who had found traditional economics courses dry and irrelevant discovered that economic thinking was actually a practical toolkit for understanding and navigating their own lives. The presentation that transformed Maria from a local academic curiosity into a national figure took place at the American Economic Association's annual conference, where she was invited to deliver a keynote address on experiential economics and the future of behavioral research. The invitation was unprecedented. Keynote speakers were typically established professors with decades of academic achievement, not former cafeteria workers who had been conducting formal research for less than 2 years. Maria's presentation was unlike any keynote the conference had previously featured. Instead of beginning with theoretical frameworks or statistical analysis, she started with a story about a conversation she had overheard while serving lunch to Harvard students, a conversation that had led her to recognize patterns in economic behavior that traditional research had failed to identify. She described the journey from that moment of recognition to the development of a research methodology that could systematically incorporate lived experience into academic analysis. She outlined the specific ways that experiential economics could address limitations in current behavioral research and suggested applications for policy development, educational reform, and scholarly practice. But the most powerful portion of her presentation focused on the broader implications of her work for how academic institutions recognized and cultivated intellectual talent. Maria argued that universities had a responsibility to identify and support brilliant minds regardless of the educational pathways through which they arrived at scholarly work. Intelligence is not distributed according to educational privilege, she told the audience of economists from universities across the country. The insights that can transform our understanding of economic behavior exist in communities that academic institutions have traditionally ignored. Our responsibility as scholars is not just to conduct rigorous research, but to ensure that the communities most affected by economic policy have voices in the research that shapes that policy. The presentation received a standing ovation, and the video recording of Maria's keynote became one of the most viewed presentations in the conference's history. Within days, she was receiving invitations to speak at universities, policy organizations, and research institutes across the United States and internationally. Media attention followed academic recognition. Maria's story was featured in profiles that appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Television interviews and radio appearances introduced her research to audiences far beyond academic economics, sparking broader conversations about educational access, intellectual merit, and the value of diverse perspectives in scholarly research. But Maria was careful to ensure that media attention didn't overshadow the substance of her academic work. She used interview opportunities to discuss the specific contributions of experiential economics, rather than simply telling her personal story of transformation from cafeteria worker to researcher. The goal was to establish the legitimacy of her methodology, not to promote herself as an inspirational figure. The most meaningful recognition came from the communities that had shaped Maria's understanding of economic behavior in the first place. Working-class families, who had been the subjects of her research, expressed gratitude that their experiences were being recognized as valuable sources of economic insight, rather than simply problems to be solved by external experts. Community organizations began inviting Maria to present her research findings and to help develop programs that incorporated experiential perspectives into economic education and policy advocacy. She found herself serving as a bridge between academic research and community knowledge, translating scholarly analysis into practical applications while ensuring that academic work remained grounded in lived reality. This community engagement led to the establishment of the Experiential Economics Initiative, a research program housed within Harvard's economics department, but designed to maintain ongoing connections with the communities most affected by economic policy. The initiative funded research projects that combined academic analysis with community collaboration, ensuring that scholarly work addressed questions that were relevant to people navigating economic challenges in their daily lives. Maria served as the initiative's founding director, a position that allowed her to mentor other researchers who were interested in incorporating experiential perspectives into their work. Many of these researchers were themselves non-traditional scholars who had arrived at academic economics through unconventional pathways. And Maria's example had demonstrated that intellectual excellence could emerge from diverse educational backgrounds. The initiative's first major project was a comprehensive analysis of economic decision-making among immigrant families. Research that combined statistical analysis with ethnographic observation conducted by scholars who had themselves navigated the economic challenges of immigration. The methodology that Maria had developed was being applied to questions that traditional economic research had addressed inadequately, producing insights that had immediate applications for policy development and community support programs. As the initiative grew, Maria realized that her individual transformation from cafeteria worker to research scholar had catalyzed institutional changes that extended far beyond her personal academic achievement. Harvard's economics department was becoming a place where diverse perspectives were not just tolerated, but actively cultivated, where lived experience was recognized as a valuable source of scholarly insight, and where academic excellence was defined broadly enough to include intellectual contributions that emerged from non-traditional educational pathways. The changes were reflected in the department's recruitment and admissions practices, which began actively seeking students and faculty whose backgrounds included substantial life experience in the communities most affected by economic policy. Graduate programs started offering alternative pathways for applicants whose intellectual qualifications were demonstrated through community work, professional experience, or independent research rather than traditional academic credentials. These institutional changes created opportunities for other scholars whose brilliant minds had been overlooked by traditional academic gatekeeping. Maria frequently received communications from people across the country whose intellectual potential had been constrained by educational barriers, economic circumstances, or institutional prejudices that failed to recognize unconventional forms of academic preparation. Some of these individuals became research collaborators, contributing insights and analysis that enriched Maria's ongoing projects. Others pursued their own academic pathways, using Maria's example as evidence that intellectual merit could be recognized and cultivated regardless of its source. The community of experiential economists grew to include scholars at universities across the country, creating a network of researchers who brought diverse life experiences to bear on economic questions. 5 years after Maria had first encountered Professor Blackwood's impossible assignment, she found herself preparing for the most significant presentation of her career, a congressional hearing on economic policy and community impact. Members of Congress had invited her to testify about how experiential economics could inform federal programs designed to support working families during economic transitions. The invitation represented recognition that Maria's research had transcended academic discourse to influence policy development at the national level. Her analysis of economic decision-making among vulnerable populations had provided insights that were directly applicable to government programs, and policymakers were seeking her expertise to ensure that federal initiatives were designed with realistic understanding of how people actually navigate economic challenges. Maria's testimony focused on the gap between policy assumptions and lived reality, demonstrating how programs designed to support working families often failed because they were based on theoretical models that didn't account for the psychological and social factors that actually drove economic behavior. She presented specific recommendations for how federal programs could be redesigned to align with the decision-making patterns that her research had identified. The congressional hearing was broadcast nationally, introducing Maria's work to audiences that extended far beyond economics and academia. Her testimony sparked discussions about evidence-based policy development, the importance of including affected communities in research and program design, and the value of diverse perspectives in scholarly analysis. Following the hearing, Maria received invitations to consult with government agencies, international development organizations, and policy research institutes seeking to incorporate experiential perspectives into their work. Her methodology was being applied to questions ranging from poverty reduction strategies to small business development programs, demonstrating the broad applicability of approaches that systematically integrated lived experience with academic analysis. But perhaps the most significant impact of Maria's work was its influence on how academic institutions understood their role in cultivating intellectual talent. Universities across the country began developing programs designed to identify and Support brilliant minds that had been overlooked by traditional admissions processes, recognizing that academic excellence could emerge from diverse educational pathways. These programs created opportunities for people whose intellectual development had been shaped by life experience rather than formal education, providing pathways for community leaders, self-taught experts, and practically minded innovators to contribute to scholarly discourse. The model that Maria had established at Harvard was being replicated at institutions nationwide, expanding access to higher education while enriching academic research through the inclusion of diverse perspectives. Maria's daughters, who had watched their mother's transformation from invisible service worker to internationally recognized scholar, were completing their own educational journeys with a deep understanding of how intellectual potential could be cultivated and expressed in multiple forms. Carmen was pursuing graduate studies in social work, applying insights from her mother's research to her work with economically disadvantaged families. Her sister Rosa was studying education policy, focusing on how schools could better recognize and develop intellectual talent among students from non-traditional backgrounds. Both young women understood that their mother's achievement represented more than individual success. It demonstrated the importance of creating educational opportunities that recognized intellectual merit regardless of its source, and ensured that brilliant minds weren't lost due to institutional barriers or economic circumstances. The Experiential Economics Initiative had grown into a nationally recognized research center that was influencing how social science research was conducted across multiple disciplines. The methodology that Maria had developed was being applied to questions in sociology, psychology, public policy, and community development, demonstrating the broad relevance of approaches that integrated lived experience with academic analysis. Graduate students from universities across the country were applying to work with Maria and her colleagues, seeking training in research methods that combined scholarly rigor with community engagement. The initiative had become a destination for researchers who were committed to ensuring that academic work addressed questions that were relevant to the communities most affected by social and economic policy. As Maria prepared for another day of research, teaching, and consultation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from serving breakfast in Harvard's dining hall to directing a research initiative that was influencing policy development at the national level. The transformation had been more complex than the inspiring narrative that media coverage sometimes suggested. It had required intellectual courage, institutional support, and the recognition that academic excellence could emerge from diverse educational pathways. But the most important insight from her journey was that transformation was reciprocal. While Harvard had provided Maria with the platform to develop and share her intellectual contributions, her presence had transformed the institution itself, challenging assumptions about merit, expanding definitions of academic qualification, and demonstrating the value of diverse perspectives in scholarly research. The cafeteria worker had become a scholar, not by abandoning her identity or apologizing for her background, but by insisting that her experience was valuable and that her insights deserved recognition. In doing so, she had created opportunities for others whose intellectual potential had been constrained by institutional barriers, demonstrating that academic excellence was not the exclusive province of traditional educational pathways. Years later, when students asked Maria about the secret to her success, she would tell them that there was no secret, only the recognition that intelligence exists in every community and that academic institutions have a responsibility to identify and cultivate that intelligence, regardless of the forms it takes or the pathways through which it arrives. The goal was not to prove that extraordinary individuals could overcome systemic barriers, but to eliminate those barriers so that extraordinary contributions could emerge from every corner of society. The woman who had once served lunch to Harvard, students, while dreaming of understanding economic theory, had transformed into a scholar whose work was reshaping both economic research and educational access. But her greatest achievement was not personal recognition or academic success. It was the demonstration that intellectual transformation was possible for anyone willing to claim their right to participate in scholarly discourse and to insist that their insights deserved recognition. Maria Santos had proved that brilliance could not be contained by institutional assumptions about who deserved access to educational opportunities. In the process, she had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others whose intellectual potential had been waiting for someone to demonstrate that academic excellence could emerge from anywhere if institutions were willing to recognize it when it appeared. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.